Hey class, today we're going to be stitching a sample that is going to teach you about straight stitching as well as understitching and grading. So you already know how to straight stitch. The other two are going to be a little bit new, and so we're going to use piece number 1 and piece number 2 to complete our first sample. So the purpose of understitching is for a facing or the inner layer of fabric on a piece to help the outer edge from rolling out. So I'm going to show you using this duster where the understitching is on it and what it is helping the garment to do in terms of how it lays on the body. So on this duster you can see that I have a facing on the inside. So the facing runs along the back of the neckline and down each side. Okay. Now the purpose of this is to help to give a nice finish to this edge, okay, without the stitching being visible on the outside. On my t-shirt I have this for my neckline, but not all shirts are going to have that. So what's another way to finish it? Well, it's by creating allowing stability, creating some thickness here, not too much bulk, and avoiding stitching on the outside. So you can see, and I'll try to get nice up close, you can see some stitching on this side of the facing, but no stitching on the outer part of my fabric here, the outer layer. So if I open these up, you can see the seam allowance, but notice that the seam allowance is pressed towards the facing, okay, and the stitching is actually going through all the layers. So the seam allowance, both layers, pressed towards the facing and stitched through. You can see the stitching right here. Okay, so when you do that, it keeps this facing from rolling out, because I don't want to have any of my facing showing. That's kind of sloppy, right? So this actually keeps this nice and stable. I'm going to show you how that's done. All right, I have piece number 1 and piece number 2 for the patterns right here, and I'm going to show you how we're going to line up our fabric. This is muslin, so there's no wrong side, but if this were fabric with a right and wrong side, we put it wrong sides together. Okay, and these notches are an indicator of where we should line up our two pieces. They're the same width, and we're going to line up the edges here, notches, and we're going to pin, which is exactly what I did. And I pinned it this way because when I sew, I'm going to want to be able to take them out from the right hand side. So I want you to set up your pieces, and then we're going to stitch them. Okay. We're going to start stitching at a 5/8 inch seam allowance, and we're going to begin and back stitch. Okay. Right. Making sure that our stitch is on stitch length 2. Okay. And take out my pins as I go. Straight stitching. Making sure that I back stitch at the end as well. Okay. And trim my threads. Okay. Now we're going to grade our seam allowances, or our one seam allowance. I like to press my fabric, press my seam open, press as you go. Okay. And grading is whenever we reduce the bulk here by taking down the seam allowance. So the facing is the side that we want to grade, and we're going to grade this seam allowance right here by trimming it in half. You can also set that off to the side, it makes it easier, and just cut this down to half of its width. Alright, having a hard time with that last bit. Really having a hard time with that last bit. Alright. Okay. It's fighting me, moving away. Alright, so now I have this trimmed down, I'm going to press this side of the seam allowance over. With your iron, you're going to press down the seam allowance towards the facing, which is also piece number 1 that you just created, and I like to press from both sides. Okay. Now we're going to take it over to our sewing machine and stitch. To keep the facing from rolling out to the outer side of the garment, we're going to understitch now through all layers. So understitching is whenever you sew the seam allowance to the facing itself. So I'm going to start by stitching, and I'm going to stitch very close, about 1/8 to 1/4 inch away from the original seam line, stitching straight with a standard stitch all the way to the end, back stitch, and clip. And now you can see the stitching through just this one side, and if I finger press it in place, you see it doesn't roll out. Okay? Got a nice neat edge here, and that's how you understitch.